Andrew said something and George started crying. They were in a pub, late at night, 1981. They weren't famous yet, just two 18-year-old boys talking about dreams. And then Andrew got serious. He leaned across the table, the music loud around them but his voice quiet and clear. "George, I need to say something, and you don't have to say anything back. But I want you to know, I see you. I really see you. And whatever you are, whoever you are, it doesn't matter to me. You understand?" George froze. "What do you mean?" Andrew smiled. A sad smile. "You know what I mean, George. You know. And I'm saying, I'm with you. Always. Even if you're different." George's eyes filled with tears. Because no one had ever said that to him. No one had ever accepted him. But Andrew was. Right there. In that loud pub with terrible music and cheap beer. Andrew was telling George that he saw him. The real him. And that it was okay. Before we reveal what promise Andrew made that night and why breaking it haunted him for the rest of his life, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. This is the story of a friendship, a promise, and a betrayal that changed everything. The pub was called the Three Crowns, a dive bar in North London, November 1981. Cold outside, warm inside from too many bodies. George Panayotou and Andrew Ridgeley had been friends for 3 years. Met at Bushy Mead School when they were 15. Bonded over music, over dreams of making it big. By 18, they were inseparable. They talked about forming a band, about becoming famous. But that night wasn't about dreams. It was about truth. George had been quiet all evening. Andrew noticed. This was different. This was the silence that came from carrying something heavy. Andrew ordered another round. Sat back down and decided to just say it. "George, whatever's going on with you, you can tell me. You know that, right?" George looked up. His eyes were wet. "I can't." Andrew leaned forward. "Why not?" George's voice cracked. "Because if I tell you, you'll leave. Everyone leaves." Andrew felt something break in his chest, because he understood then what George was carrying, what George couldn't say. "I see you," Andrew said. "I really see you. And whatever you are, it doesn't matter to me." "You don't know what you're saying." Andrew smiled. "I know exactly what I'm saying. You're different, George. I've known that for a while. And I'm telling you, it's okay. I'm with you. I'm not going anywhere." George broke then, started crying. Right there in the pub. And Andrew reached across the table and took his hand. Held it, let George cry. And when George finally stopped, Andrew made him a promise. No matter what happens, no matter how famous we get, we stay together. We're in this for life. And I will never judge you, never leave you, never abandon you. I promise. George believed him. Because what else could he do? Andrew was the first person who had ever accepted him. The first person who knew the truth about who George was. And didn't run. Andrew stayed. And promised to keep staying. And for 5 years, Andrew kept that promise. They formed Wham in 1982. The band took off faster than either expected. By 1984, they were massive. Global superstars. And through it all, Andrew was there. By George's side. In every interview, every photo shoot, every concert, Andrew was the constant. The safe place. The reminder that George wasn't alone. George needed that desperately. Because the bigger Wham got, the more George had to hide. The straight heartthrob image. The girls screaming. The constant pressure to be someone he wasn't. It was suffocating. But Andrew was there. And Andrew knew. And that made it bearable. Because George could go home after pretending all day. And Andrew would be there. And George could just be himself. Didn't have to perform. Didn't have to hide. Andrew had promised. and George trusted that promise more than anything. But then, things started to change. By 1985, George was writing more seriously, wanted to be taken seriously as an artist, and Wham! Felt limiting. George wanted to grow, and Andrew supported that. But Andrew also knew what it meant. If George went solo, Wham! Would end. And their partnership would end. And Andrew would have to figure out what his life looked like without George, without the band, without the fame. It scared him. But he didn't say that to George. Instead, he agreed. They would do one more album, one more tour, and then end Wham! While they were on top. The final Wham! Concert was at Wembley Stadium on June 28th. 1,986, 72,000 people. A massive celebration. The end of an era. George and Andrew performed together one last time. And it was beautiful. And heartbreaking. Because George knew, even if Andrew didn't, that this was the end of more than just the band. This was the end of the promise. After Wembley, Andrew went back to his life. Racing cars, surfing, being a normal person. He thought he and George would stay friends. Stay close. But George needed more than friendship. George needed the promise. Needed Andrew to be there. To be the safe place. But Andrew wasn't there anymore. He had moved on. George tried to reach out. Called Andrew. Suggested they get together. But Andrew was always busy. Had plans. Was traveling. And slowly, George realized Andrew had left. Not dramatically. Not with a fight. He had just quietly stepped out of George's life. And the promise made in the Three Crowns in 1981 was broken. George felt it like a physical wound. The one person who had promised never to leave had left. The one person who had accepted George was gone. And George was alone. With his secret. With his pain. With the weight of fame and the impossibility of being himself in public. The years that followed were difficult for George. He launched his solo career with albums that were massive successes. But George was miserable. He was trapped in a persona he had created. It was all performance. And George hated it. Hated himself. And missed Andrew. Missed the promise. Missed feeling safe. In 1990, George met Anselmo Filippa. And for the first time since Andrew, George felt like maybe he could be himself with someone. Anselmo accepted George. Loved George. And George fell completely. But then Anselmo got sick. And in 1993, Anselmo died. And George was alone again. Devastated again. And he thought about Andrew. About the promise. About how if Andrew had kept his word, maybe George wouldn't have been so desperate for acceptance. But Andrew wasn't there. Andrew had moved on. Built a life away from the spotlight. Got married. Seemed happy. And George was drowning. In grief. In addiction. In self-destruction. And he kept waiting. Waiting for Andrew to remember. To come back. To keep the promise. But Andrew never did. George's struggles became public. Arrests, scandals, breakdowns. And through it all, Andrew remained distant. He would make statements of support when asked. But he didn't show up. Didn't call. Didn't reach out in any meaningful way. And George felt that absence like a betrayal. Because Andrew had promised, in 1981, "I will never leave you." But he had. On December 25th, 2016, George Michael died. He was found in his bed at his home in Goring-on-Thames. He was 53 years old. And those who knew George understood. He had been slowly dying for years. From grief, from loneliness, from the weight of living a lie, and from the abandonment he felt when Andrew left. Andrew was devastated by George's death. And in his grief, something broke open. He started remembering. The pub, the promise, the handshake, the whisper, "I will never leave you." And Andrew realized what he had done. He had broken the most important promise of his life. and George had died waiting for Andrew to remember it. At George's funeral in March 2017, Andrew spoke openly for the first time. "I made George a promise when we were 18 years old. I promised I would never leave him, that I would accept him no matter what, and I broke that promise. When Wham ended, I left. I went back to my life, and George was alone, and I think about that every day. Maybe if I had kept my promise, things would have been different. Maybe George wouldn't have suffered so much. Maybe he would still be here." The confession shocked the public, because the narrative had always been that George and Andrew were lifelong friends, that Wham ended amicably. But Andrew was revealing a different truth, that George had been abandoned, that the promise had been broken, and that Andrew lived with the guilt every single day. Andrew is now 62 years old. He lives quietly, and he carries the weight of 1,981 with him every day. The promise he made, the promise he broke, and the friend who died waiting for him to keep it. George Michael spent his entire adult life looking for what Andrew had given him in 1981. Acceptance, understanding, a promise of loyalty. He found it briefly with Anselmo, but Anselmo died, and George never found it again. He died alone, on Christmas Day, still waiting, in some way, for Andrew to come back, to remember the promise. The tragedy of George Michael's life isn't just that he struggled with his identity in a world that wasn't ready to accept him. It's that the one person who promised to accept him walked away and never came back. This story reminds us that our words carry weight, especially when spoken to people who need them most. Promises made to vulnerable friends aren't casual commitments, they're lifelines. And when those promises break, the damage can last forever. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more untold stories about the legends we thought we knew.